Our lecture today will deal with the human skull. Human skull has 22 bones. It has two parts. The first part is the cranium. In the cranium, we have 8 bones fused at sutures. This cranium protects the brain and provide muscle attachment, sinuses, and it reduces the weight of the skull through the sinuses. The second part is the facial bones. They are 14 bones. It gives shape to face and also provide muscle attachment. This is a picture for the cranial bones. We have 8 cranial bones. Frontal, 1 in the forehead and the upper eye orbits. Second, we have parietal bone. We have 2 bones, 2 parietal bones at the sides and the roof of the cranium. Third, we have the temporal. We have also 2 temporal bones, sides and floor of the cranium, and the picture that show these bones. Also, we have sphenoid bone. It is 1 bone at the base and the sides of the cranium and parts of the orbit. And we have ethmoidal bone. Also, it is 1. It forms the walls of the nasal cavities and the floor of the cranium and the orbit. And the lastly is the occipital bone. That is 1. It is at the back and the base of the cranium. What do we mean by fontanelle? Fontanelle are space between the bones of infant skull where the sutures intersect. Include, we have anterior fontanelle and posterior fontanelle. The bones of the skull can be divided, as we said, as the cranial bones and the facial bone. The vault is the upper part of the cranium. We call it vault. The lowest part of the cranium is called base of the skull, and this is shown clearly in the second picture below. The skull bones are separated, united at immobile joints called sutures. So the sutures, the major sutures present in the skull are first, coronal suture. This is the junction between the frontal and parietal bones. Second, lambdoid suture. This is junction between the parietal and occipital bones. Third is the sagittal suture. This is junction between the 2 parietal bones, as seen in the figure beside. Now, observe the pterion. What is the pterion? It is the intersects that the course of the anterior division of the middle meningeal artery here is present. We have 4 bones that unite in this region, so it is a weak point, and under it we have the middle meningeal artery. So trauma of the head will injure this artery, and it is the most labile, the most area that is suspected to fracture in the skull, so because it is weak point. Now, the base of the skull is the lowest part of the cranium. This is a complex area that varies in depth and has numerous openings for the passage of the cranial nerve, blood vessels, and the spinal cord. The base is divided into 3 large spaces called anterior fontanelle, it is anterior cranial fossa, middle cranial fossa, and posterior cranial fossa, as seen in the picture above and below. We have special features for each bones in the skull. We have a special feature of the temporal bone. What we mean by the special features? We mean that parts of the temporal bone, we have a zygomatic process, we have a styloid process, we have mastoid process, and we have external auditory meatus. This is the 4 adaptation or modifications of the temporal bone, and this is each one has a special function. Now we have special features also of the occipital bone. We have foramen magnum. This is a large opening for the brainstem to pass through it into the spinal cord, as seen here in the figure. This is a large foramen. And we have the occipital condyle on the sides of the foramen magnum. They are rounded projections for articulation with the first vertebra of the cervical region, that is the atlas. The facial bones. We have 14 bones in the facial. We have maxillary 2. It means it will form the upper jaw and the roof of the mouth. Nasal bones, bridge of the nose. Zygomatic 2 also. Nasal also 2. This is present in the cheek and walls of the orbit, as seen in the figure. We have lacrimal 2 also, medial walls of the orbit. And inferior nasal concha, that is 2, walls of the nasal cavity. Mandible 1, this is the lower jaw, only movable bone in the skull. So the only movable bone in the skull is the mandible, and this is single. And again, we have another single bone in the facial bone. We have vomer. Vomer, it will form the nasal septum. So we have 2 single bones in the facial bones. That's the mandible and the vomer. Palatine bone, there are 2. It will form the roof of the mouth, that is the hard palate. Sometimes this hard palate, we have a cleft in it, so we call it cleft palate, incomplete fusion of maxilla and palatine bones. And this is a pathological condition. And we have also special features of the facial bone, especially for the mandible. We have mandibular condyle. This is for articulation point with the temporal bone to form the TAM joint, temporomandibular joint. The coronoid process, another one. This provides attachment for the chewing muscles. This is in front. While in the back, we have mandibular. So the mandible, the final body structure, bony structures visible in a lateral view of the skull is the mandible. Inferiorly, in the anterior part of this view, it consists of the anterior body of the mandible. Again, we have a posterior ramus of the mandible and the angle of the mandible, where the inferior margin of the mandible meets the posterior margin of the ramus. The teeth are in the alveolar part of the mandible of the body, and the mental protuberance is visible in this view. The mental foramen is on the lateral surface of the body, and the superior part of the ramus of the condylar and coronoid process extend upward. The condylar process is involved in articulation, as said before, of the mandible with the temporal bone, and the coronoid process, as we said, it is the point for the attachment of the temporalis muscle. Now, we'll take the cervical vertebra. The main distinguishing characteristic of the cervical vertebra, they have all transverse foramen. And also, it have a pivot spinous process. And again, the third characteristic is the vertebral foramen is triangular in shape. The atlas is the first cervical vertebra. It has no spinous process. It has no body. This is the second character. It supports the skull, that is atlas in mythology. It has a superior articular facet. It is a kidney shaped, concave, articulate with the occipital condyle of the skull. The most striking feature of all cervical vertebrae is the foramen in the transverse process. This is called foramen transversum. This is the for the passage of the vertebral artery. C1 vertebra is named the atlas because support the skull on the top of the vertebral column. The C2 vertebra is named as the axis because turning the head toward the right or to the left through it. We have also a characteristic vertebra, this is C7 vertebra, being a transition between cervical and the thoracic vertebra. It has a spinous process larger than the other cervical vertebra. It is called the vertebral prominence. You can just put your fingers on your back of the neck. You will feel it. at the lowest part of the back of the neck, turning of the head to the left and right. The axis is the second cervical vertebra. It has a superior articular facet. This will articulate with the atlas and rotate on these facets, and it has a dens. A dens is a dontoid process. This is in the just present in the striking feature in the axis. Again, the seventh cervical vertebra, it has a very long spinous process, recognizable through the skin. We can feel it, especially in the neck flexion, and it has, as we say, the vertebral prominence. This is about the skull. Now we will go into the scalp. What is the scalp? Definition. This is the scalp. It extends posteriorly from the superior nuclear line of the occipital bone, anteriorly from the supraorbital margin of the frontal bone, laterally it is over the temporal fascia to the superior temporal. Now, what are the layers of the skull? SCALP. This is the name of the scalp. Look, just these letters will lead you to the S. It means to the skin. C, it means to the connective tissue. We take the first letter for each one. A, this is the aponeurosis of the occipitofrontalis muscle. L is the loose areolar connective tissue, that is subaponeurotic space. And P, lastly, is the cranium or periosteum of the skull. So simply we can remember this is through these layers of scalp through its name. Now, what we mean by the occipitofrontalis? Look in this picture here. We see a muscle above. This muscle. This is frontal belly. It has a frontal belly of the and occipital belly of the occipitofrontalis muscle. And it has in an epicranial aponeurosis that attach the frontal belly of occipitofrontalis anteriorly with the occipital belly of the occipitofrontalis posteriorly. The arterial blood supply of the scalp, it will be taken from 5 arteries on each side. Now, what are they? 3 in front of the auricle, 2 from behind the auricle. The 3 in the front of the auricle, they are the supratrochlear, supraorbital, and superficial temporal artery. From behind the auricle, we have 2 arteries, that is posterior auricular and the occipital artery. This is the main blood supply. I will not go into details. This is the main blood supply of the scalp. This is in a brief arterial supply of the scalp. The sources of arterial supply, this is mentioned as black here from the internal carotid artery via ophthalmic artery, and it's the branch, supraorbital or supratrochlear, and the red one is from the external carotid artery. Now, we have also the occipital artery. It is a branch of the external carotid artery. I make it a circle inside this. See here clearly in the figure. It ascends from the apex of the posterior triangle in company with the greater occipital nerve. It supplies the skin over the back of the scalp and reaches as high as the vertex of the skull. This is the occipital artery.